Edwards going to be up there this?
Hello, good evening, everybody. I am live with Victoria Valentino, and it is a harrowing story. So, viewer discretion advised, but it's also a story of recovery. And, we're going to get to it in three sections. We're going to talk to Victoria about her life and her career and what things were like growing up. And then we'll go through what happened with Cosby, etc. And then we'll get into the recovery section. But first, huge thank you for coming on, Victoria.
Well, thank you for having me, Sean. It was wonderful to be invited.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Connecticut, primarily Manhattan, New York, and Connecticut, but I was born in Hollywood. And my father was killed in World War II in 1944 in the Mediterranean when I was about 16 months old. My mother remarried eventually to an old Disney artist who was a background artist on Fantasia and Pinocchio and Bambi, all the old classics. So I grew up as a Scot-Irish, English, Scandinavian kid, but Sicilian. So it was very interesting. My parents used to sing opera together in the kitchen while they were cooking lasagna and ravioli. And, so I grew up with a singing lesson every day because they talked about perfect pitch and open throat and head tones and diaphragm breathing and projecting and all of that. And so, they were very interesting people.
And what was school like for you?
Well, we moved around a lot. So until we got to Connecticut when I was about 10 years old, I was, moving from place to place. And it was very difficult, really, to establish close friendships. I was always the bookish girl, I loved to read, and I, loved classical music, and I had been an only child, so I was more comfortable with adults than I was making, chatter with peers. And people used to think I was stuck up, I am told, because I would be there with my nose in a book, but it was only because I was extraordinarily shy. And it was my way of coping and pretending I didn't care,
That's unusual, isn't it, to get into classical music at such a young age? Who were you listening to back then?
Oh, well, I loved Schumann's Piano Concerto in A minor, Grieg. Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez was one of my favorites of Rodrigo's, and Haydn, and of course, all of the Italian opera impresario, the writers, the composers, Verdi and Puccini, and Chopin. I love Chopin's waltzes. But I also love the Beatles and Donovan and Neil Young and Crosby, Stills and Nash, and I'm a 60s and 70s rock and roll girl. So Eric Clapton.
Who were your favorite authors then, as well? You said you were into books a lot.
Yeah, well, my mother was a very literary woman, as was my grandmother, and so whenever I looked like I was at odd ends, they would hand me a book to read, and they had all these books from way back, like the 1700s, and so I wound up reading a lot of old books, old stories from pre-Revolutionary War days, but I read Tolstoy, I read Dostoevsky, I read Chekhov, I read Ibsen, Shakespeare. I did a lot of Shakespeare as a teenager, performing, because I was an actress, Glee Club and the Thespian Society and all of that. So I loved Shakespeare, and I performed St. Joan in Oh, I'm blanking.
Sorry, take your time.
Anyway, it was this one monologue where St. Joan was basically consigning herself to the flames because she was confronting the Inquisition, and they were telling her that if she didn't admit to, being a fraud, essentially, that she would be, consigned to the flames. But even if she admitted it, she would still be imprisoned for the rest of her life, and she couldn't imagine being in a dungeon away from her angel voices and riding her great steed out in the fresh air with the birds and the trees and the sky and all of that. So that was one of my favorite parts.
So with all of these influences on you at such a young age, what did you want to be when you grew up, kind of thing?
Well, I wanted to sing and dance on Broadway. First of all, I wanted to be an archaeologist because I was fascinated by archaeology, and I wanted to go to Africa and India and feed starving children. That was one of my earlier things, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. And my folks were all involved with show business, so that was the only world I was really knowledgeable about. I was surrounded by a lot of crazy theater people on Broadway, courtesy aunties and courtesy uncles who were performing, and The King and I, and all of these different, they call me Mister, and 40s and 50s bohemian theater people. So that was sort of my background, and everybody breaking out and singing arias and show tunes, and so my parents kind of always steered me away from anything that wasn't something they understood and valued. And, so ultimately I discovered that while I was very shy amongst my peer group, once I got on stage, all bets were off. The larger the audience, the better.
The more energy you feel, the larger the audience, don't you?
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of live theater, because you don't get that when you are doing film or television. You don't have that feedback, and it is the energy. I mean, it's a synchronous thing, it's synergistic, when you have a live audience, you're playing to humans, who then have feelings that you feel, and they kind of vibe back to you. So, there's this energy exchange, and it's just marvelous. I mean, there's no drug in the world that's better than that.
So what happened when you graduated from school?
Well, actually, I didn't graduate, but I didn't tell anybody until I was 40 something. I lied because I was so ashamed of not graduating. But I had gone away to school in New York for my senior year of high school to the American Theater Wing and majored in musical theater. And then in the morning, I was going to a school for theater children called the Professional Children's School. And my classmates were none other than Christopher Walken. Ronnie was his name. It took me years before I figured out that Ronnie was Christopher Walken. But anyway, and Lauren Hollander, pianist, and Ben Hecht, who's a famous screenwriter, deceased now. His daughter, Jenny, and I were best friends. And it was wonderful. And so the director of the school on Sundays would have teas at her Sutton Place Greystone for the senior girls and the UN diplomats who were in session at the United Nations that period of time during the year. And so we were supposedly being taught international etiquette, and everything. But I started wondering after years, thinking, well, maybe she was getting some kind of a kickback, because I don't know if I was the only one who lost her virginity that year to
Mm.
some diplomat. But anyway, my parents found out. And I got shipped off to my grandmother in Hollywood. They yanked me out of school just before finals. And under the pretense of my going for the summer to see grandma, I basically got dumped in West Hollywood, and went into a huge depression, and wound up essentially being vulnerable to a rather horrible predator,
Okay.
who turned out to be the father of my deceased son. Um,
Okay, let's go over this more slowly then, because I moved to Arizona as a young person when I was about 20, early 20s, and I used to visit Los Angeles. I used to visit Hollywood quite a lot. Very very busy place, isn't it? So what was that like for you as a young person in Hollywood?
well, it was really pretty awful, actually. I was a duck out of water, but and I always saw myself as a New York girl, cultured, more of a sophisticate. And I got out there and I couldn't understand why people weren't dressing up and wearing heels and a suit to walk down Sunset Boulevard. And everybody was kind of slopping around in shorts and flip flops, and walking slowly. And I was walking at a fast New York clip all the time. And I trusted people that I shouldn't have trusted. But I did get involved with an old folk singer, a guy named Hoyt Axton, who um, became an actor. He was in the Gremlins, but in those days, I guess I was 18 and he was 26, and he was, kind of gritty balladeer, and sang all the old folk songs. And he wrote a few songs actually that became quite famous. A song, "Joy to the World,
Mm.
all you boys and girls," but that came later. Wrote Greenback Dollar and the Pusher Man and all of that. And we traveled when he was on tour, um, before his first album came out. So he taught me guitar and got me to put my poetry into music. And that got me started as a folk singer.
Mm.
So even though all of this other stuff was going on, that sort of grounded me in many ways, because I'd always been a writer. And even as a child, I wrote haiku and I wrote poetry, and so then I learned a few chords on the guitar, and I could then write songs. And so I did that. And then, of course, Vietnam came along and the civil rights movement, and that gave me a cause. And and then 1967, the Summer of Love. But in the meantime, I had a child. Who I had to support. And, it kind of forced me into acting in not uh, really bad films, but, crappy films, really. Um, I guess I think they called them sexploitation films, but they weren't. Um, um, I mean, they show more in Outlander, at this point in time. They show more on daytime TV. It was all kind of simulated on the surface, but it was a storyline. But usually, every excuse to, have the actress drop her top. So it paid the rent. I was a Screen Actors Guild member, but Screen Actors Guild was only wages, I think, were $50 more a day. And it was very difficult to get a regular Screen Actors Guild job. Those were the diamonds. And so I could work all the time and make enough money to pay the rent and, buy my kid clothes and get food in the house. And the problem with it was that I had been raised in a certain way, And it dragged me down so much, emotionally and psychologically. And my parents had moved back out to California by that time. And, they were shunning me, and, it was just not a good thing. And of course, my first husband was Afro-Cuban in 1963. So, that didn't do much to, elevate their opinion of me in those days.
Victoria, how old are you when you arrived in Hollywood?
18.
And did you say that there was a bad situation arose quite quickly with somebody when you arrived?
Well, the first thing that happened, my grandmother made me get a job once she discovered that I was there for good. And I got a sales clerk job at some department store on Hollywood Boulevard. And the girls invited me to go to a party at a friend's house off the Sunset Strip. And I walked in and, still felt like a duck out of water, growing up in a pre-revolutionary town with, very conservative background, basically, even though my folks were sort of bohemian in many ways. And the host just walked straight up to me and put his finger in my mouth. And I was so upset. I found a phone and I went and I called my Algerian professor friend in New York and wept and cried and begged him to send me money to fly back to New York. And of course he said no, because he saw that I was incapable of being independent, and he would not, he was not willing to take me on, basically. Anyway, it was just very demeaning and demoralizing, and I just kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper into depression, and couldn't pull myself out of it. And so I wound up, being pretty much of a sitting duck for people who were not the kindest and most elevated, aware human beings on the planet. They were not spiritual. They were not kind. They saw the pretty face and the nubile body and the makeup that made me look a lot more sophisticated than in fact I was. And I wound up being kind of drawn in by this Afro-Cuban drummer who had been an escort to another folk singer. And I had met him through my roommate, because I'd moved out of my grandmother's house, yada, yada, and he just took over my life. He had come with this friend to visit my roommate and saw my jewelry and my good clothing. And I guess in the process of all of us sitting around smoking and drinking red wine and talking and getting loose in the tongue, he found out that I had a little bit of an inheritance coming when I was 21. And he started showing up at my door and acting as though he cared about me and, time to get your hemlines fixed. Give me your Italian knit suits so that I can take them to the tailor. The hems are coming up. Of course, I never saw them again. And it just progressed from there. And he was also the one who, with another photographer who had the idea that they should submit photographs of me to Playboy, a magazine I had never heard of. I was used to my father using models for his art. And so it never occurred to me that modeling for the man I thought was my husband at that time. We had gone to Mexico to get married. And I didn't know that if it wasn't registered in this country, it was not legal. But he knew. He was about 14 years older than I. And he knew that I was coming out of the 40s and the 50s, and you turn over your money to your husband. My mother always taught me that. You know, don't worry about arithmetic, dear. I was never good at it, and you never will be either, because you don't need to be. Your husband will take care of all of that. And so he certainly did. And so he and Harry Drinkwater, this African-American photographer who actually was a professional photographer, they had me modeling for them. And it was under the illusion, I thought that I was helping them to become well-known photographers. And by submitting my photographs to this magazine that they were enthralled with, I was helping their careers. It never occurred to me that it was anything for me. Well, as it turned out, they turned over all the photographs, and I wound up becoming Playboy's Miss September 1963. And Playboy owned all the photographs, and they were never heard from again, the photographers, which didn't sit well with anybody. So my husband, if you can call him that, he decided to market me in some way or another in order to make up the difference. And so for 3 horrible months, using my Playmate celebrity at that time, I was sold to the highest bidder, and it just about destroyed me. And when I tried to escape, I was beaten to a pulp, and I managed to call my mother, who I had found out was now living in an apartment with my father, who had gone back to work at the studios. And without her warning me, she set the police up. And I also had hit my husband's 2 children, who were toddlers, and the baby, my baby. And my stepson opened the door, and the LAPD saw some interracial people there, and they used that as an excuse to barge in. That was 1964, October. And they barged in, arrested everybody, and my case was dismissed, but I lost all of my children.
No.
Yes. I was able to get my son back after a year, but my stepchildren, who didn't remember me as anything but their own mother, were not allowed to come back to me because they weren't legally or biologically mine. And they were abused in the foster home. And I didn't reconnect with them until probably about 12 years ago. And of course, they were already in their 50s by then. And it was just purely karmic. My youngest daughter was on an audition. She was the casting associate. And my stepdaughter, who grew up to be an actress, wound up being one of the actresses coming in for that day's casting call. And my own daughter recognized her name and turned around and said, "Was your brother this, I think my mother was your stepmother." And my stepdaughter's eyes filled up with tears. And she said, "So how many stepmothers am I supposed to have?" And they wound up hugging and being in touch and going out and hanging out for a while before she felt comfortable seeing me. She had heard about me, but didn't really remember me. And of course, losing her had changed my life entirely and haunted my dreams and everything about my life, always. So, it was, it's been quite a journey.
So that was really harrowing, and that was in your 20s?
I was 21 when that
was you was 21 when that happened.
It's October 64. And then the Playboy Club, the first Playboy Club on the Sunset Strip, opened New Year's Eve, 64. And I was free at that point. And so I had gotten a job working at the Whiskey A Go-Go cocktailing after I was out and away and free. And we heard that the Playboy Club was opening and looking for any of the playmates in the area to come and be bunnies. You know, the playmates are the centerfolds and the bunnies are the waitresses. So I went over and I worked, I think, probably the first 6 months at that club. Yeah.
What was
And
that like?
oh, it was the hardest job ever.
Mm.
It was an 8-hour shift in 3-inch high heels and costumes that were very uncomfortable and a lot of rules and regulations. And it wasn't as fun as working at the Whiskey A Go-Go, I can tell you. Yeah.
What were the rules and regulations?
Well, first of all, you had to show up an hour before you had to be on the floor for, the hour you didn't get paid for, and get into your costume, your makeup, your false fingernails, your false eyelashes, bust pads, and ears, and fluffy white tails, and all of that. And if you got a run in your stocking, or if you got a scuffed shoe, or if your ears weren't on straight, or if your tail got a little dusty, you would get demerits. And if you got 30 demerits, you would be fired. But you could earn back merits if you did promotions. So they got a lot of free television promotions out of us, because of course we didn't want to get fired. We were making a big $2.03 an hour. But we made such great tips that sometimes we'd forget to pick up our paychecks.
So what was your life like as you approached your mid-20s?
Well, it was a struggle. I was a single mom of a biracial toddler, and Vietnam. And I think the best year for me was the summer of love, when all the hippies started flooding into Los Angeles, and I started cooking for feed-ins and getting involved with protests against Vietnam, just continuing on with that, and civil rights, and promoting love and peace, and dancing with beads and feathers and bells, and we dropped a little bit of acid and a little mescaline and chewed a peyote bud or two, and found God, and that was actually very healing, because it really opened me back up to a time when, because I'd always been a very spiritual child. And so it really connected me back to my love of nature and spirituality, and it unleashed a lot of just creative thought. And I wrote a lot of good songs that year. And then I wound up that was 1967. 1968, I was initiated into transcendental meditation. And I loved that. That was wonderful as well. And then came 1969, and I did a few films. I was an extra in one of the Roger Corman films called, it was an H.P. Lovecraft story called Dunwich. And we went up on location. I took my son, and we were up 2 weeks in Mendocino County, and it was just absolutely magnificent. The children were running in the green emerald fields and playing in the deep woods when we were on location. And I became friends with the late actress Sandra Dee. Her son was there, and he was a year older than my son. And so, they played, and I made a commitment to myself and to him at that point that as soon as I was able I was going to take him and we were going to move up to Mendocino because I just wanted him to be raised in nature and amongst down to earth people, who were grounded in something authentic. And so that was in the spring of '69. And then I was doing a couple of films, and in between takes, I was picking a little guitar, and one of the other actors heard my music. And he said he knew an agent who was trying to find talent for a producer at Capitol Records. And that producer was the lead guitar for the Animals, and a guy named Vic Briggs. And I played for him, and he said, "Do you want to make an album?" And I said, "Sure." So that started me on that journey. And then I wound up having a music attorney who was giving me a party to celebrate the successful negotiation of my recording contract, and my son drowned in his swimming pool at the beginning of that party. My son had just turned 6.
Oh my God, I cannot believe what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Oh my God, Victoria.
So,
Whoa.
that changed everything. And I found out afterwards, he told me that my son was a fly in the ointment. And he had just been researching military academies. And he was angry with me that I couldn't possibly continue my relationship with him. He had told me to go into the house. He was outside working on his wine cellar that he had just completed. And he sent me inside to his sister-in-law was coming up the walkway with a case of wine to christen his wine cellar. So he was out there by the pool with my son. And I have long suspected that even though he didn't push him in, that he kind of maybe encouraged him to go down the slide, because with this little styrofoam surfboard, my son wasn't a skilled swimmer. And when I found him at the bottom of the deep end of the pool, face down with the styrofoam surfboard floating, it looked like he had gone headfirst down this slide and never come up. So that was instant insanity, I would say. I didn't complete the album because I just lost my music and I lost my heart. So shortly after that, about 3.5 weeks after that, my grandmother died, and I moved into her house with some roommates. And one of my roommates and I went to a little cafe called the Cafe Figaro. And that's where I ran into Bill Cosby for the second time. I had gone for an audition just prior to that. And because I was running out of my advance money for Capitol and I needed to eat. And my friend Francesca knew Cosby and set up an interview. And I showed up on the lot and handed him an 8x10 of my son. But he met me in his trailer wearing sweats. It wasn't an audition hall. And I think my son's photograph is what saved me from being assaulted in his trailer, because I have since learned that he assaulted a 14-year-old girl in his trailer. So I think that was what was most likely on his mind at the time. And he sat and he looked at my son's 8x10. It's the most marvelous photograph, black and white, with my son's little 60s afro looking directly into the lens, and serious and soulful and deep. And Cosby was mesmerized. He couldn't take his eyes off of my son. And I think it must have taken him back to when he was 4 and abused by his father, and I think possibly he saw something of himself before he was the monster that he became. And I just sat there rattling off the story of what had happened. And I got so uncomfortable because he wasn't responding. He just couldn't take his eyes off my son's photo. And finally, I just got up and snatched the photo and said, "Thank you very much." And I walked out, and he was caught off guard. But by that time, he knew my story, you see. And so he used that as an excuse in the restaurant to come up to us. And he had also been mesmerized by my roommate's eyes. She was an actress with very pale blue eyes, almost white blue eyes. And he used my story, my knowledge of my grief. And I was crying that day. I was having a terrible, terrible, terrible day. I just couldn't stop sobbing. And he just took advantage of that. And he put her in charge of me. He said, "I'd like to treat you girls to a spa, and I'll give you the money to my girlfriend, and then let me know when you're finished, and I'll send my driver over to your grandmother's house and have him pick you up, and I'll treat you to dinner. I think it would be good for Vicky," which people used to call me in those days, which I hate. But anyway, so we did. We went to dinner, and I was still I really was in no shape to be anywhere. It was years, before I was functional in any kind of way. So I sat there playing with the food on my plate, and he was making a lot of, his unintelligible jokes, and I wasn't paying attention, and he was chatting her up, trying to charm her, and I was ignoring them both, just kind of counting the moments until I could get back home and curl up in bed in a fetal position again. And he put a pill down next to my wine glass and said, "Here, take this. It'll make you feel better." And I guess, I have to admit at that point, nothing mattered to me anymore. My son was dead, and he was all I ever lived and breathed for. So, I took the pill. I thought, great, I hope I will feel better. And he gave her a pill, and then he pretended to take a pill himself. And then he reached over in a while and put another pill directly into my mouth and directly into her mouth. And pretty soon our faces were in the plates. And I said, "I want to go home." And he said, "Oh, no problem. I'll take you." And we went to the parking lot, and his driver was gone. And I remember asking, "Where is your chauffeur?" And he said, "Oh, he had something else to do. I will take you." And of course, he didn't take us back to my grandmother's house. In fact, he took us way up into the Hollywood Hills to what he said was his office, but was undoubtedly his bawling pad, And she went directly over to a little love seat. It was clearly not a working office. And he was sitting next to her, and she was unconscious. And I saw that what he had on his mind, and I tried to distract him, but I was so drugged that whatever he gave us, I don't even remember. I never took downers, I was not that person. I was a quarter horse, not a trotter. So I liked diet pills in those days to get more work done, work longer hours, And so I was really sensitive to anything that might have been a sedative. And I tried to talk to him, and whatever I was saying was garble. I couldn't get it out of my mouth. And, I felt like Frankenstein in the old movies, and I was, grasping towards him, and finally he got so irritated. He stood up and he walked towards me very angrily. And I stood up because I was afraid I was going to get hit, having been beaten within the inch of my life many times in the past from my son's father. So I stood up and my knees collapsed, and I grabbed hold of him to keep from falling. And the next thing I knew, I was on my knees and he was on the love seat, and rest is history. And then he abandoned us, and we had no idea where we were. It was probably about 10:30 at night, and we were somewhere up in the Hollywood Hills. And I said, how are we going to get home? He said, call a cab. And he walked out. And I woke her up, and we staggered over to the phone, but we didn't know where we were. So she said, well, let's call home. And we thought maybe her boyfriend would be able to figure it out. And so we picked up the phone, and there was no dial tone. She said, oh, it must have come out of the jack. So she got down on her hands and knees under the desk, and there was no jack. It was an old prop phone, and the cord was cut. So then we realized, we had totally been duped. And so we ran out of there, and we were fearful of getting into the elevator because we thought, what if he came back and the door opened and he was there and we'd be trapped with him again. So we found the stairwell and clattered in our little high heels down onto the street and stood there and looked out, and way below us, the jewel lights of the city. And we just kept running downhill until we got to the Sunset Strip, and miraculously a taxi was driving by. She hailed it and it stopped, and we got home. And I became very suicidal after that. And at that point, I decided that I would take my son in my heart, and I would get out to the country and leave everything behind. And my producer, Vic Briggs, lived out in Topanga Canyon with his wife, and they found a little place for me to stay. But my emotions, I think, were so raw. The woman was actually afraid of me, I was told, which is crazy, but I can understand it in retrospect. I was very cynical and angry and in terrible pain in those days. So I found a dirt floored garage that I lived in for almost a year, $50 a month. And I put my Persian rugs on the dirt and hung India prints against the concrete walls, and had a clay abachi from the Barbados Islands. And I walked in the hills with my son's dog and wrote a lot of painful songs, and was pretty crazy person. I drove around the curves in the canyon pretty fast, and had a jug of hard cider by my heels. And I even mainlined cocaine one night. And, I just figured I had nothing left to lose at that point. I'd lost everything. So my karma led me to this crazy singer-songwriter from Louisiana, poor little rich boy, son of a Cajun congressman, who, as it turned out, was quite an alcoholic. But one day he said to me, Vicky Blue, I love you, girl. I'm leaving for New Orleans in 10 minutes. You going with me? And of course I said, sure, nothing to lose. And so we went to Louisiana, and can't shoot the messenger because he took me to his mother. And his mother was the mother I never had. She was humble. She was loving. Her eyes would fill up with tears, and she'd look at me and say, Sha, I love you. I love you. And I left him, I can't tell you how many times, and I would go back for her, because when I got home to my own mother, I was not welcome. And I'd turn right around and hit the road and drive another 4 days back to Louisiana for her. And she never never asked any questions. She'd make me a bed on the sofa, and there was always a big pot of gumbo, and she'd hand me a cold beer and just tuck me in and love me. And she saved my life. She saved my life.
Victoria, my head has exploded several times because of what you've been through. It's like you must be reliving some of it, telling us about it. You're so brave. And everyone in the chat watching this live, it's just so much love and respect for you coming in and support. And we salute your bravery, you
Thank
know, sharing your life story in such detail. You're such an excellent speaker, but good grief.
you.
I've got a 2-year-old son here. He just turned 2 at the weekend. And when you told me about your son, honestly, that was just like a sledgehammer to the brain. I can't imagine the pain you have been through and how you felt in the aftermath of that. But please, at this point of the story, is this where it turns around and nothing more bad happens to you from here? Please tell us that's the case. That's the case, because I don't know how much more we can take.
Well, the story goes on, but I can tell you that I need to grab my little charger and plug in really quickly. I just got to notice that my phone is getting low.
Yeah, please do that. I'll talk to the viewers while you do that. No problem at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you everybody. For just being so kind with your words and the support that's come in. And I hope that from now the rest of the story's sweetness and light. So Victoria has a book out. It's called Dirty Diamonds: The Repurposed Life of a Playboy Icon and Cosby Survivor. Victoria's book came out on November the 22nd, 2023. It's got 5 stars on Amazon. And the link for that is in the description box below this video. And there's also a website. Victoria's also got a website. It's www.victoriavalentino.com. And the link for that, if you're watching on YouTube, is in the description box below the video. I know a lot of people are watching on X as well. But you might have to go over to YouTube if you want to check out those links. And you can also, the book's also on amazon.co.uk if you're watching here in the UK as well. But it's called Dirty Diamonds: The Repurposed Life of a Playboy Icon and Cosby Survivor. And
I am plugging in.
Oh, thank you, Victoria. All right. So hopefully
we've got it.
Good.
Old phones, Okay.
All right, there we go. Yeah.
Hello.
All right, so we left off then, and you'd found a beautiful new life, and
well, it was peaceful. I had a baby, a little girl, who's wonderful, and he was, as I said, a pretty terrible alcoholic, and I wound up after 3 years having to leave, and took my daughter and went back to the family. And once again, we have these illusions of what home is, right? And so we think we're going home when in fact home is within us, and the people that we think are there to love us unconditionally often are the worst in terms of being judgmental and critical and unfeeling, lacking in empathy. And so I wound up spending a summer, and my wonderful cousin, who has passed away, unfortunately, from cancer, she remembered who I was before all of the ugly stuff happened. And that summer I stayed with her, and she was 4 years younger. She was like a little sister to me. And one day she said, put some clothes on, grab your purse. I'm taking you somewhere, and don't ask where. And I said, okay. And we went to a local junior college, and she handed me a registration form, and she handed me a class schedule, and she said, pick 2 classes, fill out this form, I'm paying for the classes. And so I wound up taking Spanish and psychology, and I wound up getting an A and a B plus. And it was probably the greatest gift anybody had ever given me. And it got me started going back to school. And I recommend it highly, because what going back to school does for you, on a college level, just a community college, you can take 1 or 2 classes where you can take a 2-year vocational program, and at the end of it actually have a profession, physical therapy assistant, respiratory therapist, registered nurse. But I, being someone who had grown up with an artist who had a studio in the house, as soon as I walked into the art department, of course, I smelled turpentine and oils and stuff. And so once I took that semester and I moved up to Portland, Oregon, and registered immediately for the community college up there. And I took 2 years of art history, basic design, graphic arts, and ceramics. And my little girl and I wound up moving out on a farm at the end of that 2 years with my third domestic partnership. He had been a roommate in the house that I lived in Portland, and we had this really deep, soulful karmic connection. And so I had a 22-acre farm and started collecting dairy goats and chickens and ducks and pigs, and learning goat husbandry, and had another baby girl, who I home birthed. And most triumphant moment of my life, I can tell you that having a baby at home with a good midwife is 150,000 times better than having a baby in a sterile clinical setting in a hospital, unless of course you have health problems that need emergency treatment. But it was amazing. Unfortunately, her father turned out to also be a drinker, and he wound up letting me know after the baby was born that we had been evicted from the farm because he had drunk up all of the farm money. So with a 1-month-old baby, we were homeless. A 6-year-old daughter by then, and a newborn baby. So we lived that summer in a VW bus, camping out all over Oregon, which I had to make fun. And it was fun if I hadn't grieved for my wonderful herd of goats, who all answered to their names. And, I shrieked as they were being sold off and having to go down the dirt road in the back of a pickup truck. And my nanny goat never took her eyes off of me until she went around the windbreak, and it still haunts me to this day. I felt like such a traitor, I would have probably still been on the farm all these years later if it hadn't been for that. But anyway, so we camped out, and then we wound up getting a trailer at the end of the year so that my daughter could go to 2nd grade. And flat broke, and I thought, well, what can I do? So I noticed there was a little boutique art gallery in town, and I got some poster paper and some felt tip pens, and I made some signs and put myself out there as a dance teacher, and I had already spoken to the woman who owned the boutique. She had a 2nd floor with a big open floor in the gallery, and she let me teach dance classes to children. And So I did that, and then I expanded and started teaching dance exercise to adults as well. And one of them had an 85-year-old couple. Her parents lived up in Rainier, Oregon, on 40 acres overlooking the Columbia River amidst orchards. And she said, you could live on that 40 acres, if you would just kind of keep an eye on my parents. They really don't need anything, but I can't be up there. And so we moved the trailer into a winter apple orchard, and I would walk down and, visit and harvest the filberts and the petite plums and the apples and,